The heavy oak doors of my study in Montepulciano have always been my sanctuary, a fortress against the scorching Tuscan sun and the even more scorching betrayals of those who share my blood. It has been exactly 3 years since the night of broken glass, as I privately call it, the night my empire, built on generations of winemaking and shadow diplomacy, was nearly dismantled by the two women I loved most. I, Alessandro, had spent a lifetime decoding the secrets of rivals and protecting the family estate from external threats, only to be stabbed in the back within my own walls. My ex-wife, Isabella, did not just share her bed with my greatest rival, Dario, a man whose ambition is only matched by his lack of morals. She shared my private ledgers. And my daughter, Sophia, she didn't just take her mother's side. She was the one who handed over the key to the safe. So, when the phone rang late last Tuesday, shattering the silence of a rainy evening, I knew before I answered that the past had come to collect a new debt. It was Sophia. Her voice was not the arrogant, defiant weapon she had wielded against me in court 3 years ago. It was trembling, fractured, the sound of a porcelain doll that had finally been dropped. She wasn't calling to ask how I was, or to apologize for the perjury that nearly sent me to prison. She was calling because her world, built on the shifting sands of Dario's promises and her mother's delusions, was collapsing. She told me that Marco, her husband of 6 years, a man I knew was nothing more than a polished pawn in Dario's game, had thrown her out, not just for another woman, but for her best friend. A classic move to humiliate her. She was homeless, destitute, and terrified. I listened to her weeping, staring at the glass of Chianti on my desk, a vintage from the year she was born. The irony was bitter. She wanted money for a lawyer. She wanted to come home to the villa. Rossi. She wanted her father to fix the mess she had actively helped create. She spoke of family duty and unconditional love, phrases that sounded like foreign curses coming from her mouth. She had forgotten that when I was on my knees, facing the loss of my heritage due to her testimony, she had called me paranoid and obsessive, claiming her mother's affair with Dario was true love and that I was the villain for investigating it. She had defended the theft of my intellectual property as fair division of assets. Now, the wolves she had fed were turning on her. I told her, with a calm that terrified even me, that I could not help her. I lied. I could buy her freedom 10 times over. But I hung up, not out of petty spite, but because I needed to know why the enemy was suddenly discarding such a valuable asset. Refusing Sophia was merely the opening move in a new game. I needed eyes on the board. Someone who operated outside the suffocating social circles of Italy's elite. Enter Elena. She isn't a lawyer, nor is she strictly a private investigator. She is a fixer, a woman, of sharp angles and even sharper intellect, whom I had employed during the corporate wars of the late 90s. I summoned her to the villa an hour after Sophia's call. Elena arrived in the rain, shaking off a trench coat that smelled of ozone and stale tobacco. I poured her a drink and laid out the situation. My concern wasn't paternal affection, that, well, had been poisoned years ago, but strategic curiosity. Why would Dario, who controlled Isabella and practically owned Marco, allow Sophia to be discarded so publicly? It felt orchestrated. It felt like bait. Elena's initial intel confirmed my darkest suspicions. Sophia wasn't just kicked out. She was being erased. Marco had seized her bank accounts, claiming joint liabilities that didn't exist, utilizing documents with signatures that looked suspiciously like forgeries, or perhaps signatures coerced under duress. But the real twist lay with Isabella, my ex-wife, currently living in a palatial estate in Florence funded by Dario's dirty money, had also rejected Sophia. The narrative was perfect. The prodigal daughter shunned by everyone, forced to crawl back to the bitter old father. If I took her in, I would be welcoming a Trojan horse. If I didn't, I risked losing the only witness to the original theft of my company's secrets. Elena revealed that surveillance cars, black sedans with tinted windows, unmistakable as Dario's security detail, were parked down the street from the cheap motel, where Sophia was currently hiding. They weren't protecting her. They were waiting for her to move. The next day, the pressure mounted. My mother, the matriarch of the Rossi clan, called me. She is a woman who believes in appearance above all else, unaware of the rot beneath the floorboards. She demanded I forgive Sophia, citing the scandal it would cause if a Rossi was found living in squalor. I argued, cold and detached, reminding her that Sophia was an adult who had made her choice to side with thieves. But internally, my mind was racing. Sophia showing up at my gate with her luggage was inevitable. When she finally arrived, hammering on the iron bars of the Villa Rossi, soaking wet and hysterical, I watched her from the security monitors. I saw the desperation, yes, but Elena, standing beside me in the shadows of the control room, pointed out something else. Sophia kept glancing at her phone, not looking for messages, but checking its position. She was being tracked. If I opened that gate, I wasn't just letting in my daughter. I was inviting Dario's surveillance network into my sanctuary. I spoke to her through the intercom, my voice distorted by the static of the storm. I told her to leave. I told her to go to her grandmother. It was the hardest thing I have ever done, not because I felt pity, but because I knew. I was sending a lamb back into a forest full of wolves to see who would bite first. Sending Sophia to my mother's estate, Villa Caterina, was a calculated risk, a move on a chessboard that I knew would force Dario's hand. My mother's home is a fortress of old-world etiquette, but practically speaking, it is indefensible against the kind of modern warfare Dario wages. Elena and I set up a mobile command center in a van disguised as a vineyard maintenance vehicle, parked on a ridge overlooking the estate. Through long-range lenses, we watched the predictable unfolding of events. Sophia was pacing in the garden, a nervous wreck, while my mother undoubtedly lectured her on the importance of appearances. But the real action was invisible. Elena had managed to clone Sophia's phone signal when she was at my gate. As we sifted through the encrypted backups of her device, the narrative of a scorned wife began to crumble, revealing something far more dangerous underneath. Sophia hadn't just left Marco. She had fled with leverage. It took Elena 3 hours to crack the hidden partition in Sophia's cloud storage. What we found changed everything. It wasn't love letters or proof of infidelity. That was merely the smoke. The fire was a series of digital ledgers and audio recordings. It appeared that my daughter, despite her betrayal of me, had inherited enough of my paranoia to keep an insurance policy. For the last year, she had been secretly recording Marco's business meetings where he and Dario discussed the laundering of funds siphoned from my company 3 years ago. They weren't just stealing profits. They were using my old distribution networks to move contraband through the ports of Livorno. Sophia possessed the smoking gun that could put Dario away for life and dismantle his entire operation. No wonder they had kicked her out and frozen her assets. They were trying to flush her out into the open to recover the data before she realized its full value or handed it to me. The realization hit me with the force of a physical blow. I had assumed Sophia came to me for money, a prodigal child seeking comfort. In reality, she was running for her life, carrying a nuclear warhead in her digital pocket. She likely didn't even understand the full extent of what she had. She thought she had leverage for a divorce settlement. I knew she had a death sentence. As the sun began to set over the Tuscan hills, the black sedans we had spotted earlier began to move. They weren't waiting anymore. Dario must have realized that. Sophia was stationary and isolated at an elderly woman's house, away from my direct protection. The wolves were done circling. They were preparing to breach. I looked at Elena. She was already checking the load in her sidearm. The time for observation was over. If I didn't act now, my daughter wouldn't just be disowned. She would be a casualty of war. The assault on Villa Caterina began not with an explosion, but with silence. The exterior lights of the estate flickered and died as Dario's men cut the power grid. It was a sophisticated move, designed to sow panic and confusion inside while covering their approach in darkness. I didn't wait for them to breach the doors. Putting the van into gear, I drove straight through the vineyards, crushing rows of Sangiovese grapes that had stood for decades, aiming directly for the rear terrace. Elena was on the radio, jamming the frequencies Dario's team was using to coordinate, creating a chaos of static in their earpieces. We weren't trying to win a firefight. We were executing an extraction. I knew the layout of my mother's house better than anyone. I had grown up hiding in its secret passages, escaping the boring dinner parties of my youth. I smashed the glass of the conservatory doors and entered the darkened house. The screams of the maids echoed from the upper floors. But I moved towards the library where I knew my mother preferred to hold court. There, Illuminated only by the flashlight on my weapon, I found them. My mother was clutching her pearls, indignant at the power outage, while Sophia was cowering behind a heavy velvet armchair, finally understanding that this was not about divorce anymore. When she saw me, her face crumpled in a mixture of terror and relief. I didn't offer comfort. I grabbed her wrist and pulled her to her feet. "Where is the phone?" I demanded, my voice low and urgent. She fumbled in her pocket, handing it to me with trembling hands. I pocketed the device, the prize. Dario was hunting, and dragged her toward the servants' exit. We barely made it to the kitchen when the front doors were blown open. Heavy boots thundered on the marble foyer. Dario had sent professionals, likely mercenaries with no connection to the local families. I pushed Sophia into the dumbwaiter shaft. A tight squeeze, but the only way to the cellar without crossing the main hallway. "Go down," I hissed. "Elena is waiting at the loading dock. Do not stop. Do not look back." As the ropes of the dumbwaiter creaked, lowering her into the darkness, I turned back to the kitchen entrance. I needed to buy them 90 seconds. I wasn't armed with a gun, but with something far more potent in this specific environment. I opened the valve on the industrial gas range and struck a flare, tossing it onto the oil-soaked rag I had grabbed from the counter. A wall of fire erupted between me and the hallway just as the first shadow appeared in the doorway. The explosion of heat bought me the distraction I needed to slip out the side door, into the cool night air where Elena's engine was already roaring. We had the girl. We had the data. But as we sped away into the night, leaving the flames of my childhood home in the rearview mirror, I knew the bridge back to a normal life had just been incinerated. We drove in silence to a safe house I maintained in the Apennine Mountains, a brutalist concrete structure buried in the side of a cliff, accessible only by a single winding road. It was here, surrounded by the humming servers of my private network, that we finally opened the Pandora's box Sophia had smuggled out. Elena connected the phone to our isolated system, and the digital autopsy began. What we found was not merely evidence of smuggling. It was a blueprint of systematic destruction. Dario and Marco had been leveraging my company's reputation to secure loans they never intended to repay, funneling the cash into offshore accounts in the Caymans. But the true knife in the heart was not financial. Buried deep within the audio logs was a recording from 3 years ago, dated 2 days before the night of broken glass. I listened, stone-faced, as the voices filled the cold room. It was Isabella. My ex-wife wasn't just a passive beneficiary of Dario's schemes, as I had always believed. She was the architect. On the tape, her voice was clear and chillingly calm as she instructed Dario on exactly which files to steal from my study to cripple me legally. She spoke of me with such venom, such calculated hatred, that even Elena looked away in discomfort. Sophia, sitting in the corner wrapped in a wool blanket, wept silently. She had known. She had known her mother was the mastermind and had protected her out of a misguided sense of loyalty, taking the fall and alienating me to shield the woman who would eventually discard her like trash. When she became inconvenient, the realization that my daughter's betrayal was actually a coerced act of protection for a monster broke something inside me, but it also forged a new resolve. I wasn't just going to defeat Dario. I was going to obliterate the entire board. We spent the next 48 hours compiling a dossier that would make the collapse of Rome look like a minor renovation. We didn't just target the illegal activities. We targeted the egos. Elena leaked specific financial documents to the Ndrangheta families Dario had foolishly borrowed from, ensuring that his enemies on the street would be looking for him long before the police arrived. Simultaneously, I prepared a package for the Guardia di Finanza, Italy's financial police, detailing the tax evasion and money laundering schemes. But for Isabella, I reserved a special kind of hell. I drafted a legal reclamation of assets based on the new evidence of corporate espionage, which would not only strip her of the Florence estate, but leave her liable for millions in damages. I watched Sophia as I finalized the commands. She didn't object. The daughter who had once called me selfish for investigating. Her mother now watched with cold, hard eyes as I prepared to destroy her. She had finally learned the family lesson. Loyalty is currency, and she had spent hers on the wrong person. The end came not in a courtroom, but at the grand autumn gala at the Palazzo Pitti in Florence. It was the social event of the season, a masquerade where the city's elite pretended to be virtuous while drinking wine that cost more than a teacher's annual salary. I attended alone, wearing a tuxedo and a Venetian mask of stark white. From the balcony, I watched Dario holding court, Isabella draped on his arm, looking triumphant. They believed Sophia was broken and silenced. They believed I was defeated. At precisely 10 o'clock, the doors to the grand hall swung open. It wasn't guests who entered, but a squadron of uniformed officers from the Guardia di Finanza. The music stopped. The silence that followed was more delicious than any vintage I have ever produced. I watched as the officers surrounded Dario. He tried to bluster, tried to make calls, but his phone had been remotely bricked by Elena minutes earlier. When they put the handcuffs on him, his eyes scanned the room wildly until they locked onto me on the balcony. I slowly removed my mask, raising my glass in a silent toast. The color drained from his face. Beside him, Isabella was not arrested, not yet. Her punishment was to be left standing, alone in the center of the ballroom as her lover was dragged away, realizing as the whispers began that her shield was gone, and the legal summons were already waiting on her doorstep. Marco was picked up at the airport trying to board a flight to Brazil. The cancellation of his credit cards had flagged him instantly. The dismantling was total. The empire they tried to build on my stolen legacy had crumbled into dust in a single evening. I returned to Villa Rossi the next morning. The air was crisp, smelling of rain and crushed pine needles. Sophia was waiting for me in the study. She looked different, older, harder. We didn't hug. The chasm between us, dug by 3 years of lies, was too wide to be bridged by a simple embrace. Instead, she poured 2 glasses of wine and placed a set of keys on my desk. The keys to the safe she had once opened for her mother. It was a peace offering, a surrender, and a job application all in one. I took the glass. We stood looking out over the vineyards that had survived storms, droughts, and wars. I told her that she could stay, that she could work. But that trust is like a broken mirror. You can glue it back together, but you will always see the cracks in the reflection. She nodded, accepting the terms. I took a sip of the Chianti. It was bitter, complex, with a long finish. Just like family.